I haven't come across a lot of people talking in the way that you do, I guess. I mean, people talk perhaps at a more superficial level, but yeah, you're interested in phenomenology in a very applied sense, and in a much more detailed way, I guess, than Gestalt therapists who are working phenomenologically or trying to do. So that interests me that, in some ways you've got a particular contribution and a particular critique. You're saying, well, sure, Gestalt people or people who practice phenomenologically are doing their best to bracket and pay attention and all that kind of thing, but there's a whole lot that they're not paying attention to.
Well, they don't know how to. No one's ever showed it to them. I was fortunate. I had a few teachers who showed me something about it, or demonstrated it. I went through psychoanalysis through the William Allen White Institute in New York. They're the existential psychoanalysts. And the guy I worked with was a training analyst there. But he had a whole other level of attention going, and he knew how to pay attention. And that first level of it, he modeled that a lot by doing it with me. And I'd go, how'd you know that? And he wouldn't explain it to me, but after a while, I could know when he was going to know something about me, because I could see it coming, and that was very useful. And so, but even more useful, the self-knowledge I gained from working with him enabled me to really start to see how much I project. And therefore, I started to realize how much everyone else projects, and that you don't just have an intuition. You have to, actually learn how to have, perceptions other than pure deductions or pure inferences about people. I mean, some of what I do is inferential, in that I observe one thing, pick up another thing, and those two things allow me to infer a third thing. And
I think many therapists do that.
Oh yeah. It's just one of the things I use, they tend not to use. I'd like to see them using it.
So, in addition to what you've said about that, what is something else that you would point people to do, therapists or people in general, to do more of that? Like what?
Well, you want to go through, therapy is usually for solving some kind of emotional issue in your life. You have to go past that. Analysis of some form goes past that. You have to really gain a real working knowledge of what your unconscious spits out in the world, and what bubbles up from it. And you have to gain some real consciousness of what's going on at the unconscious level, and be able to recognize your unconscious coming out and showing itself in various ways. And analysis was extremely useful for that. That was, I am so grateful to Lloyd for that, because he was really absolutely spot on, masterful, and unrelenting. Unrelenting. And it was good, because I was a kind of a fighter. You said something to me I didn't like or didn't believe, I'd fight with you. So he was both tough enough and kind enough, and I'm grateful for that. And he was the first black psychoanalyst in America.
Wow.
Yeah, he unfortunately died young, because in being who he was trying to accomplish so much, also in civil rights, that and he had basically
sickle cell anemia.
Sickle cell anemia, that he'd inherited. And it turns out to be a good adaptation for West Africa, which was rife with mosquitoes and malaria, because the malarial parasite can't deal with the sickle cell blood cells. It doesn't function as well. So it was an adaptation, but it was an adaptation with a real downside, like early heart attacks and death. So I was very, very sad when he died, but very grateful that I had an opportunity to spend about 5 years around him.
Now, I mean, you use the word unconscious, and
yeah, some people don't like that word.
Yeah, I guess in Gestalt we sort of
okay, think of it this way. The part of yourself that's operating that you don't know.
Okay, that's out of awareness, sure, yeah.
Unconscious, not conscious. Not a place like maybe what people envision a Freudian unconscious. It's not a place. It's just...
Or an iceberg.
Or an iceberg. What it is your doings that you just do and have no awareness of. So, and then when you say things and when you perceive things, it also affects your perception and what you say. So what you are allowed to see is determined by your unconscious, or what you don't know is going on in you. Or it comes out of you as if it's truth. Like someone, tells you, you're a dangerous person, and they're just talking about their danger that they feel they're in, which is a danger they're carrying all the time and feel they're in all the time. And they basically assign it to certain people that may have had some resemblance in some way to where the danger originally came from. And that's what I mean by unconscious.
So,
the iceberg thing, I think, was an attempt to try to make a very new idea sort of palatable to the average person. But it really didn't work, because we don't know if there's a great hunk of a thing under the waterline. We don't know it's under the waterline because we're unconscious of it.
Okay. Well, yeah, this does sort of come back to that question, well, who are you, who am I? Self-knowledge, as you say, and the things that get in the way of that self-knowledge and the things that support it. And a therapist, and this can get tricky where, a therapist claims to have some knowledge of you that you don't have of yourself, can easily get into a sort of an authority.
Very tricky.
Yeah.
Very tricky. I have an example. Years ago when I worked at what's now called Relationship Australia, it was called a marriage guidance counselor. It had been imported from England. I lived in South Australia and I worked as a counselor there. And I remember I was working with this woman, talking to her about her relationship with her husband that was breaking down. And I said something about her sister and some role she had in this. And I'd forgotten she had never even mentioned she had a sister. And she certainly did have a sister, and that certainly was a problem. And she jumped up and she said, "You've been talking to my sister." Had not. So that's a real problem for therapy. It's one of the reasons I don't do therapy anymore. That'll always leak out in one way or another. It didn't happen a lot, but and it didn't happen in such a major way that was, it was catastrophic to the therapeutic relationship. I think, we sort of calmed it down and talked a bit, but I don't think she came back, as I recall. But it was a long time ago, so I'm not sure.
That's a tricky thing in any therapeutic scenario, and possibly even more so in the kind of awareness you're talking about, where the client's not aware of something in themselves. I might notice or suspect or suggest, or possibly in your case, be more directly aware of that. So my awareness is ahead of the client's awareness.
Could be.
And that gap is problematic because...
Yes, it is. For therapy, yeah. When I stopped doing therapy, and what I do I call coaching, which is a word I hate because it's associated with sport, which I think is the actual mental disorder of Australia.
Okay, let's not get into that. But so you think that by calling it coaching, you sort of step out of that problem of having more awareness?
I said, well, it's problem solving. I'm here, like a good coach is to help you solve a problem in your performance, or what you do, or what you're trying to do. And so, I could do that. I could say, well, it's because of blah, blah. You don't have to tell me that. And I'm not trying to get you, we're not trying to form the kind of relationship we are in psychotherapy. So they could say, well, I don't think that's true. And you say, okay, well, tell me why you think it's not true. And it just becomes part of the solution making. It doesn't become like a possible violation of confidentiality. And I tell clients, I'm going to say what I perceive, and if you don't like me doing that, you don't want to work with me. I always have a pre-meeting before I actually take someone on as a client. And I tell them some of the things I'm going to do, and they tell me what they want. And I say, okay. And I say, sometimes what I say, might upset you. And I'm not doing it to upset you, but that's going to have to be part of the problem solving you do. And so far, I can't think of anyone who's in that context has gotten up and walked out on me.
So you're saying that from your view at this point for you, that a problem-solving frame is more useful than a therapy frame because people participate more actively, or
no, that's what I want to do, because I see that as useful, and I don't want to do therapy. Therapy is a long-term healing process, and sometimes what I do initiates healing for someone, but that's not my intention. My intention is to help them solve a problem, and if they have to heal as part of that, great. If they just have to learn a couple of new tricks, that's great. But that's the contract.
So again, you're very pragmatically oriented in that sense.
Absolutely, because I don't want to be the center of someone's healing, because I create too much difficulty for them.
It's too challenging, your perception.
It often is, or it confronts them before they're therapeutically ready.
Right, but you think in this coaching frame, there's sort of more openness to that kind of...
Think of it as an engineering thing. So someone comes in with their schematic diagram of their recent low-level DC amplifier, and I say, listen, you've mismatched that NPN transistor with that PNP transistor, and that circuit's not going to work. That's it. That's coaching. Okay?
Right, indeed. Yes, pragmatic, solution-oriented, as you say. And of course, there's some therapies that call them solution-focused therapies and such, brief therapies, which I guess may have some correlation with
Well,
that.
CBT tries to be that, but it's with many people very ineffectual, because it just says, here's the mechanics you do. That's why it's loved in Australia. It's like learning a sport. It's mechanical. And so, you give someone a booklet to read, and here's how you use your thoughts. When your bad thoughts come up, here's what you do. And it does work for some people. It certainly doesn't work for anyone who's at all introspective. Like various people I've known who've tried it and did just, this is just a waste of time. But it also doesn't work for paranoids. It doesn't work for narcissists. It works for, I think, the average kind of person who might be having some depression, anxiety, and doesn't know how to manage that, and doesn't know how to just manage living that way. They never felt that before. They grew up in a fairly, okay household. They did okay at school. They maybe went to uni. They got a job, and all of a sudden they're married. They're having kids, and they're having a lot of depression and anxiety, and they never had to deal with it because life seemed to work all right.
A bit psychoeducational.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to do therapy because of...
It's not appropriate for me. Also, I'm too impatient to do therapy. It's not appropriate for me,
Right.
because therapy is a long-term developmental process, and that's not what I want to do. In terms of my creative energies and the way I like to work with people. The coaching problem-solving model is what works for me. And I land up with clients who that works for them, or they don't hang around.
So that's your preference. I mean, although that might not be what you do, I am interested, though, in your comments about applying, subtle perception, the biofield, direct awareness to this longer-term relational-based therapy process.
Yeah, well, the thing is, in that process, most therapists are building a picture and they're missing one of the information streams. That's how I see it. And it's not necessarily to give the client feedback before they're ready. It's really about knowing enough to guide the process. And what I see, most therapists have one part of their perception, let's say their vision, they're blind. They hear well, they can feel well, they can touch well, but they can't see. And they need to see to get the fuller picture. because you know how it is. I mean, it's a long-term way you build the picture, and then you start to use that information to guide people into learning how to meet the world differently. And if someone, I mean, I've sent people away from me to therapy if I think that, you know, we're not going to solve a problem because there's some real therapeutic issues, personality disorder, or even more so, some major anxiety and stuff like that. I say, well, that's what they need to do to get to the point where they can then take on the other problems, which they'll probably do in therapy.
I found some web results. I can show them if you ask again from your iPhone.
Stop. Hello, hey Siri, stop.
There's nothing to stop here.
Good, isn't it? I should have turned you off, Siri. Hey Siri, shut yourself down.
Now we see whether the AI really behaves itself.
Yeah. Well, this is not ChatGPT 4 type AI, you know. This is, you know, kind of basic stuff. I should have turned it off beforehand. Occasionally, it hears something that makes it think I want some information. I know I didn't say HS.
HS?
HS. You can't say
Right,
it.
okay, otherwise it
wakes
triggers,
up.
Right,
It
yes,
wakes up.
Okay. So another thing that you mentioned previously was about top-down and bottom-up processing. Of course, modalities like, say, somatic experiencing are very much explicating that, exploring that, very interested in the kind of...
How do they explore that?
Well, because they recognise that we have these different systems, and they recognise the limitations of a top-down system only as a way of, you know, particularly trauma these days is all the rage and dealing with trauma, and everything's kind of related to trauma.
There are a lot of traumatized people out there.
Well, indeed, probably always have been, but
yeah.
It's a big focus of psychotherapy in, you know, the current world.
Can you imagine what daily life was like after World War I in England? How many people came back from that totally mind-fucked? Totally. Talk about PTSD. Must have been PTSD City, a place like London.
That's right, yeah.
And the number of people missing limbs, and because, you know, they didn't try to save your limb in those days. If you got hit, they just took it off. It's just, and we keep doing wars and producing these. And of course, we know now through epigenetics and various studies that trauma passes down generations. I mean, the fact that, you know, we're not totally insane as a species, you know, is a marvel.
Yes.
It's a credit to us in one way that, you know, there must be a lot of resilience in there in some ways.
And yeah, I mean, trauma does work itself out, for instance, but I think it takes something like 3 generations after a war to start diluting. So,
and then we have another war long before
right.
then.
Exactly. So yeah, so, you know, in dealing with trauma, it's recognised, somatic experiencing, other approaches that you've got to do bottom-up work, and you can't just work with the cognitions and the thinking processes. You really have to work with somatic process and awareness of that, and kind of coming in at that place too, because that's where change kind of really happens in many ways.
Well, that could be somatic awareness, basically, you know, and a lot of schools of therapy use, you know, somatic stuff now as well. It's a type of therapy open to abuse, though, because some people get hands-on, and that I've seen some cases of abuse come out of that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously, that's a danger probably in any therapy modality, whether it be, you know, on a mental level or a physical level, but just staying with the bottom-up processing end of things. I would say that's like a contemporary view that, is parallel to what you're describing as the importance of moving away from theories and even kind of trying to guide people's thinking to working with their energies and, you know, what's happening, how trauma is held in the body and body memory and that type of thing.
Well, of course, Wilhelm Reich was first off the rank with that, as far as I know. He was a mixed bag, though, wasn't he? I mean,
Sure.
I had some brilliant insights, and he was also quite crazy.
Yeah. He broke the ground in terms of working with the
Yeah.
body, but yeah, sure, he was
Yeah.
at
And
the
then
basic beginning.
some of his therapeutic clients went on to bigger and better things.
Yeah.
Well, Fritz was one of his clients.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm.
And I think the story I heard, I don't know if it's true, that basically Reich threw Fritz out because he did, there was something that really pissed him off. You can imagine those two egos coming together in a room.
Just long enough to learn something, and then
It's kind of like a detonator beating nitroglycerin.
Well, I mean, probably, that happened with everybody in Freud's circle, that, when everybody was a strong personality and had their own ideas and went off in their different directions eventually.
Well, yeah, but that's also made for a lot of really interesting variety, and new particular schools of therapy came out of that. Sometimes I've questioned the whole value of therapy, because some people seem to get into, like, I'm thinking of Woody Allen, who was seeing his analyst for like 30 years. And did it help?
No.
I've seen this with people from, some people I knew who were self-psychologists, who were doing that sort of psychotherapy. And it's nothing to do with self-psychology, but she was keeping her clients hooked in much, much longer than necessary. Well, it becomes part of your income. Every time you cut a client out, you don't have another one coming in, your income goes down.
Yeah, well, that can be a form of abuse in some way.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But I mean, therapy can easily be prone to that, because...
Well, sometimes students are worried, and they ask me, well, aren't you fostering dependency by, stepping
That's another issue.
intensely into the therapeutic relationship in the kind of full way that you do that? I mean...
See, in coaching, one of the things I tell people, it's like when I did a PhD, it's one of the things you do. You have someone who acts as a kind of coach, a guide, a supervisor. And his job or her job is to get me functioning at his or her level, and then cut me loose to be one of them. But that's not the same thing in therapy. You're not trying to get them to be a therapist. And as a coach, I'm trying to get someone functioning with their attention to the best degree I can, and cut them loose, and then they're on their own. They can come back for a check-in once in a blue moon, but they're on their own. And my goal is to get them to my level, and hopefully occasionally, or even just in my level in certain areas, that they can then have enough mastery that their life works better.
So, in terms of therapy, you say you associate therapy with something that's more to do with healing and something more to do with long-term.
Yeah, both those things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just interested in any comments you have about healing.
Well, psychological healing is a slow process. There are short-term methods for dealing with the immediate trauma responses people have in PTSD. Kind of like the waggling finger technique of what's her name, Shapiro, and various tapping and all that. And all that's doing, it's an attention exercise, you realize. It's about attention, because what you do is you get the memory of the event and the emotional response up at the same time, and you learn to move your attention off the trauma and onto just remembering the event and disconnecting it from the past emotional response. And it's a simple, good technique for doing it. It obviously works for a lot of people. So, but in terms of, let's use Freud's term, neurosis, because someone who carries a lot of anxiety and has a lot of bouts of depression and all kinds of things, where the whole functioning of their life is overlaid with these problematic feelings and responses, and it clearly goes back to the way they were raised and what happened in their growing up, how they were parented, events at school, etc. And then there are maladaptions that then become ingrained. And the healing process is to somehow become aware of those maladaptions and learn how to alter them. And then also learn how to manage the old feelings that still arise as a result. That's a long process. I don't set out to do anything like that. I think that's a kind of hero's journey, frankly. And I ain't no hero. So I don't really, and as I said, I am impatient. I'm kind of speedy. And I'm a lot slower than I was, 30 years ago. But I don't want to do that long. And some people, that's their lifeblood. They love it. Possibly you. But it's a predilection I have, what I like to do, what's creative for me. And I like to perceive and map out my perceptions to people and have them understand what it is I'm perceiving and be able to see it themselves. And then I'm good at making suggestions of what they might do, but I don't want to spend years going through the process of them learning to do that. Either they do it on their own or find someone else to do that with. I'm a kind of, I'm either a first or last stage for people who want to do therapy. I'm either the first thing that gets them to therapy, or after therapy, they work with me to solve very specific things.
I know that you have certain criticisms of, for instance, some Gestalt notions, for instance, of closure, and that you think that there's, in some sense, been too much emphasis on the notion of closure or the possibility of closure.
It's a nonsense idea. Of course, where it comes from Wertheimer and that lot, who were doing psychological studies of perception. So if you show someone what is a circle with a gap in it, they see it as a circle because of closure. They close the circle. Or a triangle where part of a leg is missing, they close it. The closure. And that's what it was intended to mean. This idea of feeling complete and everything has, come to rest now and is okay is not closure to start with. And in many cases where people think they're going to get it, in most cases they don't. Like, my daughter was murdered and they caught the guy. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. I felt no closure. I'm not talking about my personal life, but someone I know I heard say that. Felt no closure whatsoever because she was still dead. She'd still been murdered and that guy is still alive.
Okay, that's a vernacular use of the word closure, yeah.
But that's effectively getting emotional completeness is how it's used in Gestalt therapy. And that's not what it was about. It's not feeling emotionally complete or feeling emotionally at rest, where whatever it is you're working on comes to rest. That's coming to center or coming to rest, but that's not closure. And to use closure that way has bastardized it and has led to the general population, including those going to therapy, thinking they're going to get a finishing. And in fact, there's no therapy that finishes anything. It's a course in self-management, not a course in finishing. Self-management means you're going to have the same things happen in your life, but you're going to do better at handling it. And that's what therapy is about. And healing enough so you can feel all right in yourself. But that's not closure. That's feeling all right. That's my bitch about closure.